Hello and welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Today, a House Oversight Subcommittee held a hearing on unidentified aerial phenomena, also known as UFOs. And during the meeting, 3 former military officials told members of Congress that they believe the government knows much more about UFOs than it's telling the public. In fact, they claim the government is absolutely in possession of unidentified aerial phenomenon, that's UFOs, and that non-human biologics were found at a crash site, aliens. So let's break down who these 3 witnesses are and the meeting. We're going to play some clips for you from this really bombshell hearing and really the implications. What does this mean and why are they doing this? Why is the government suddenly really interested? In fact, some of the members of Congress that left this meeting and some of the people who watched the hearing, they said this was the most bipartisan hearing that they had ever witnessed in Congress. So both Democrats and Republicans are very interested in UFOs. They want to know more. And a big question we Americans should be asking is, why is that? Why are they suddenly so in line with finding out about these UFOs? What is up their sleeve? And isn't it just so timely now that we have Space Force? I mean, thank goodness, right? Thank goodness we're spending billions of dollars. And I want to preface this with, I believe in extraterrestrial life. I mean, I don't have any evidence of it, really, except for what we see. I have to go by what the types of footage, the witnesses and whatnot. To me, it just makes logical sense that we're not alone in the universe. So I'm a person that comes from this with feeling that most likely we are not alone. Most likely there is life on other planets. And I'm not going to rule out the fact that maybe they've come and visited us and they've been here. But I believe that if they mean us harm, if they have the technology to get to Earth, which is something we don't have the technology to get in other places, if they have the technology to get all this way, they have the technology to just blow us to bits. So if they wanted to do us harm, they would have done harm to us by now. So I just want to start off with that. But here we go. Let's talk about the 3 different witnesses who testified today. First, there was David Grush. He's a United States Air Force officer and former intelligence official. He claims that the U.S. federal government maintains a highly secretive UFO retrieval program and possesses multiple UFOs of non-human origin, because remember, unidentified aerial phenomenon or unidentified flying object just means it's unidentified, doesn't necessarily mean that it's from out of this world. It could be, China's got a secret program and we just haven't ever seen this before, and it's unidentified. No, he is saying that the government possesses multiple UFOs of non-human origin, as well as corpses of deceased pilots. Ryan Graves is another person who testified today. He is a former F-18 Navy pilot. He said he witnessed unidentified aerial phenomena while he was stationed at Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And according to Graves, upgrades to jet radar systems are why we're now seeing all of these objects being detected. It's because our technology's improved. So people might ask that question, well, why now? Why are we suddenly, that's kind of my big question. Like, why now, right? When we have Space Force and now we're willing to dump billions of dollars into another wing of the military industrial complex, why now? And he says, well, it's because we've actually upgraded the jet radar systems. And so now we're seeing more of these objects that otherwise would have gone undetected because many of them are supersonic. David Fravor is a former Navy fighter pilot at the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group. He is a witness to one of the most credible UFO sightings in history. So if you've heard of the Tic Tac, he's the guy that saw the Tic Tac. And there's even recordings of this, the video evidence of this. So really interesting. So interesting witnesses. So we're going to now play you some clips from today's hearing. Truly a frightening bombshell hearing. And so let's start off with this one here. This is Representative Garcia, and he is from California. He's a Democrat from California, and he's asking whether or not they believe the government is in possession of UFOs. Take a look.
Mr. Grush, finally, do you believe that our government is in possession of UAPs?
Absolutely, based on interviewing over 40 witnesses over 4 years.
And where?
I know the exact locations, and those locations were provided to the Inspector General and some of which to the intelligence committees. I actually had the people with the firsthand knowledge provide a protected disclosure to the Inspector General.
I know the exact locations, he says. I can tell you where the UFOs are, he says. Wow. Okay. So this isn't just vague. Like, I believe I have evidence. The government has some UFOs. I've heard of this. He's saying I can tell you where they are. So these are three whistleblowers, right? They're coming forward. They're taking risks, and he's saying I've got hardcore evidence. And in fact, David Grush has the most compelling, I would say, in my viewpoint, the most compelling of the three witnesses, because he's like confident. He's got all the information. He can give you lists. He can give you names. He can give you locations. He could tell you all the details. He just couldn't necessarily do it in this hearing. And we're going to hear clips of that. Here is This is Representative Nancy Mace. She is a Republican now from South Carolina. Watch her questioning about biologics, non-human biologics. Do you have the bodies of the aliens? She wants to know. Here it is.
If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
And was this documentary evidence, this video, photos, eyewitness? Like, how would that be determined?
The specific documentation I would have to talk to you in a skiff about.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So, and you may or may not be able to answer my last question, and maybe we get into a skiff at the next hearing that we have, but who in the government, either what agency, sub-agency, what contractors, who should be called into the next hearing about UAPs, either in a public setting or even in a private setting? And you probably can't name names, but what agencies or organizations, contractors, et cetera, do we need to call in to get these questions answered, whether it's about funding, what programs are happening, and what's out there?
I can give you a specific cooperative and hostile witness list of specific individuals that were in those.
And how soon can we get that list?
I'm happy to provide that to you after the hearing.
Super. Thank you. And I yield back.
So again, here's this guy. I know where the UFOs are. I know where the bodies are, and I can give you lists. So I wish they would give us those lists. So now these Congress people are going to be able to get this information in a SCIF, which is a highly, it's a room that is for classified information. That it's a very protected room. So like your cell phone can't go in there. They're built in a way so that you can't have people spying, spies can't get to and all of that. So that's what they're talking about. Now, even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is concerned about this, and she wants to know also some information about, okay, we're hearing the whistleblower testimony. You're saying you know this. You're saying you've seen UFOs. You're saying you've seen UFOs. You're saying you've seen alien bodies. Like, where do we get the evidence, essentially? And that is what her questioning is. Watch this.
For the record, if you were me, where would you look? Titles, programs, departments, regions, if you could just name anything. And I put that as an open question to the three of you.
I'd be happy to give you that in a closed environment. I can tell you specifically.
Thank you. Commander Fravor?
And I would say, and I've told people that you have to know where to look. They're not going to divulge it to you because of the classification levels. But if you know where to look and who to talk to, which is exactly what Mr. Grush can point you, then you have them.
Okay. Mr. Graves?
I was an operator, so I was depending on folks like Mr. Grush to do that homework.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back to the chair.
Okay, so if they want the information, he can provide it for them, but we're not going to get it in this hearing. So we're just getting all the juicy stuff of, wow, they've got this information, these whistleblowers saying the government has all of this. And then it's up to these members of Congress to then follow up on that and hold meetings in a SCIF and get the actual classified information, which it sounds like they're going to end up going and doing, because this is one of those rare hearings where all of the people seem to be on the same side. All the members of Congress just want some information. What we've seen in these past hearings, when we've talked about misinformation, disinformation, the weaponization of the government, when we hear hearings, when we watch hearings of COVID pandemic, origins of COVID, what we see is really one-sided. It's usually Republicans that are saying, we want to know more about the lab leak, or we want to know more about government interfering with social media companies to censor Americans. And you've got Democrats saying, you're all a bunch of conspiracy theorists. Interestingly, the one time you would expect Democrats to say, you're a bunch of conspiracy theorists, would be about UFOs and aliens. And instead they're like, tell me more. Tell me more about these aliens. So interesting what's gone on in just American politics at this point. Okay, so more questioning going on here. This is about the sightings of supersonic speed. So these are not just, unidentified foreign objects from a foreign country, from their military development program. These suckers can go supersonic. So here's them explaining that.
Mr. Graves, again, I'd like to know, how do you know that these were not our aircraft?
Some of the behaviors that we saw in a working area, we would see these objects being at 0.0 Mach, that's 0 airspeed, over certain pieces of the ground. So what that means, just like a river, if you throw a bobber in, it's going to float downstream. These objects were staying completely stationary in Category 4 hurricane winds. These same objects would then accelerate to supersonic speeds, 1.1, 1.2 Mach, and they would do so in very erratic and quick behaviors that I don't have an explanation for.
Yeah, so if that's not alien, then there is a country out there who has better technology than we do. Can we think of one that maybe would have that type of technology? Now, according to Dr. Stephen Greer, who's been on this show, and he's one of the foremost experts on UFOs or UAPs, he says that it is actually our government, that this technology has come from aliens, that there were aliens that have come to Earth. They've brought technology with them. They've crashed. We've been able to extract that technology, and we've got shadowy government programs that even members of Congress would not really be able to find out about totally, black ops types programs that are funded. We see $1 trillion disappear from the Pentagon going to these types of programs where they're completely off the books. And that is why we can't account for the cash that gets siphoned out of the Pentagon to these programs. But he says that the technology that these pilots are witnessing is that. It is actually American technology, but it is just extremely under wraps, really shadowy programs, and they're testing, and that's what these pilots are seeing. And that these programs, they do not want that technology out there, because once it's out there, once you use it against another country, for example, then what happens? Just like how they got the technology the first time. The aliens crash, you extract the technology. Well, if we use this technology against foreign countries, then they could, same thing. We could crash, or they could somehow intercept the technology, and then they have it. So that is why Dr. Stephen Greer says we haven't been using this technology. We just have the technology. Not only that, but the implications of the technology. When it's discovered that we have it and people then know about it, this technology can power the Earth, for example. It would change the landscape of how we operate. It would change who makes money, and that is too threatening. And so that is why it remains completely shadowy, completely under wraps, and that's his explanation. So that's important to know that, these pilots are saying, we've never seen this crap before, and it could be alien, it sounds like it is originally alien, but that it's in fact being manufactured by like Lockheed Martins of the world and their shadowy, or Raytheon and their shadowy programs. And that, by the way, was Representative Burchett. He's from Tennessee. He's a Republican. Here he is also asking if anybody has been physically harmed, if any Americans, pilots, anybody's been physically harmed in efforts to cover up extraterrestrial activity. Watch this.
Have you faced any retaliation or reprisals for any of your testimony or anything on these lines?
Yeah, I have to be careful what I say in detail, because there is an open whistleblower reprisal investigation on my behalf, and I don't want to compromise that investigation by providing anything that may help provide somebody information. But it was very brutal and very unfortunate, some of the tactics they used to hurt me both professionally and personally, to be quite frank. Yeah.
It's very unfortunate, as they say, when you're over the target, that's when they do the most firing at you. Do you have any personal knowledge of people who have been harmed or injured in efforts to cover up or conceal these extraterrestrial technology?
Yes. Personally.
Have anyone been murdered that you would think, that you know of or have heard of, I guess?
I have to be careful asking that question. I directed people with that knowledge to the appropriate authorities.
Maybe in a, if we could get in a confidential area, SCIF, we could talk about that. But unfortunately, we were denied access to the SCIF, and that's very unfortunate in this scenario.
Well, I don't think it is, actually, because I like that we're seeing this. If this was all held in a SCIF, we wouldn't be able to see any of this. And so I appreciate that we're at least getting some of it. And then maybe they can go behind closed doors and open up the classified documents and be like, here's the pictures of the alien bodies. Okay, here is Representative Garcia again, a Democrat, asking, really talking about his concerns about what he's hearing and how this is a national security concern, but also that there just doesn't seem to be a way for these, well, he says there's no way for there to be these reports, for people to make reports, commercial pilots, fighter pilots to make reports about the UFOs that they've seen. But in reality, people have been reporting this for decades, and they just, get demonized as conspiracy theorists. So here he is expressing his concerns.
Particularly, Mr. Graves, one of the, I think, concerns that for members of this committee is this idea that pilots, there's no system to actually report UAPs and the stigma around pilots. And so can you just briefly, you mentioned that you're working with 30 pilots right now that have had encounters with UAPs, but you've also, I believe, discussed and know of many more pilots. This is just those that you're currently working with. Is that correct? Can you expand on that?
Certainly. I'll break that down in two ways. First, when we were first experiencing these objects off the eastern seaboard in the 2014 to 2015 time period, anyone that had upgraded their radar systems were seeing these objects. So there was a large number of my colleagues that were detecting these objects off the eastern seaboard. They were further correlating that information with the other onboard sensors, and many of them also had their own eye sightings as well of these objects. Now, that was our personal firsthand experience at the time. Since then, as I've engaged this topic, others have reached out to me to share their experiences, both on the military side as well as the commercial aviation side. On the military aviation side, veterans that have recently got out have shared their stories and have expressed how the objects we were seeing in 2014, 2015 continued all the way to 2019, 2020, and beyond. And so it became a generational issue for naval aviators on the eastern seaboard. This was something we were briefing to new students. This is something that was included in the notice to airmen to ensure that there was no accidents. And now with commercial aviators, they are reaching out because they're having somewhat similar experiences as our military brothers and sisters, but they do not have any reporting system that they can send us to.
And let me just add, both to Mr. Fravor as well as Mr. Graves, not having this system for reporting, would you both agree that is harmful to not just our national security interests, but to understand this phenomenon of what's happening with UAPs?
I think it's actually a travesty that we don't have a system to correlate this and actually investigate. So if you took the East Coast, there's coastal radars out there that monitor our air defense identification zone, so out to 200 miles. They can track these, so when you see them, they could actually go and pull that data and get maneuvering. And instead of just having the airplanes, there's other data sources out there. And I've talked to other government officials on this. So you need a centrally located repository that these reports go to. So if you just stuck it in DOD, you wouldn't get anything out of the Intelligence Committee because they have a tendency not to talk. But if you had a central location where these reports would come in, not just military, but also commercial aviation, because there's a lot of that going on, especially if you talk to anyone that flies from here to Hawaii, over the Pacific, they see odd lights. So I think you need to develop something that allows you a central point to collect the data in order to investigate.
Mr. Graves?
I would concur with everything Mr. Fravor said. I'll continue to say that the commercial pilots that have reached out to me through Americans for Safe Aerospace are doing so because they don't feel there's another way for them to report this safety issue.
And I think one of the clear outcomes of this hearing already is that there has to be a safe and transparent reporting process for pilots, both on the commercial side and the military side, to be able to report UAPs in a way that's also transparent, but also understands the scope of our national security interests and what may be classified or not. But I think there has to be some sort of system, and so that's something that I hope can be an outcome that this committee can work on.
Well, I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that they want to put together an actual official reporting system so that you're not just like going to your superior and being like, that's what I saw, something kind of weird, and then you're just labeled as some sort of a crackpot. The thing that's concerning, however, about that is what are they going to do with these? What are they going to do with these reports? And if these are shadowy, like what Dr. Stephen Greer believes, that these are American programs funded by shadowy Pentagon dollars that are disappearing, and that they are just working on this technology, and they're now showcasing this technology almost for what purpose? If you're not going to use it against your foreign enemies, then what is the purpose of doing it? One big purpose that I think many of us are worried about is to just continue growing the military-industrial complex, to continue getting more funds, that this is about justifying Space Force or justifying weaponizing space, growing the military-industrial complex to where they need to start making weapons that are going to protect us from these aliens, that would be their ultimate goal. And that makes a lot of sense if these are actually their programs and they're thinking, well, we could use these programs to scare the living daylights out of people and hold congressional hearings that now Democrats and Republicans take very seriously. And we're going to get billions more dollars for military, continuing to siphon dollars out of the American public and continue to keep us bankrupt and poor and homeless and crazy, and not dealing with all of the things that we need to be dealing with because we're just pumping money into keeping us safe from these clearly hostile aliens who could have blown us to bits by now. So that is, I think, my big concern is that this would just be weaponized to continue weaponizing. And that needs to be reined in on. And I think we need to be thinking logically about, how dangerous are these UFOs? Do we really need to be going in that direction? Because I do believe that's the direction they're going to go in. I want to leave this segment with this clip from Representative Burchett, the Republican from Tennessee, who says, I think, the thing that many of us say, and many of us wish that more members of Congress would say. All of them, please say this in unison. Here it is.
It's been so difficult to get here today. I've said, in the Baptist church, we'd say that the devil's in our way. And the devil has been in our way through this thing. We've run into roadblocks from members, from the intelligence community, the Pentagon. I proposed legislation to go in the FAA reauthorization that just said if an airline pilot has a sighting, that when he makes that report to the FAA, that it would come to Congress. But I was told that the intelligence community did not like that, and the amendment was not even heard in committee. I think it's time for this country to take back our country. We need to tell the folks at the Pentagon, they work for us. Dadgummit, we don't work for them.
They work for us, dadgummit. We don't work for them. And that is what I wish everybody would say in unison about the Pentagon, is that you work for us, dadgummit. You don't... We don't work for you. But it often feels the other way around. All right, I want to tell you about forpatriots.com. It is a company that is dedicated to helping Americans prepare for whatever comes their way, whether it's a natural disaster, another pandemic, or aliens. You never know. Could be a big alien invasion. Even if you just need enough supplies, really, just to get you through harsh summer and harsh winter weather, 4 Patriots has the products that you need. They offer a wide range of survival gear like thermal blankets. They have generators, water filtration kits. They also have many choices in survival food kits that range in size from 72-hour kits to a 1-year supply of food. So if you're worried about this summer's heat, they also have a solar generator that'll help prevent you from enduring those rolling blackouts. And that could be coming. Where I lived last September was hot as hell. And so it's good to prevent those rolling blackouts by getting a generator of your own. They also have great home and garden gear, camping gear. Check it out. Go to 4patriots.com, use the promo code Kim at checkout for 10% off your order. So last night, RFK Jr. held a 2-hour event with Rabbi Shmuley Boteach on fighting anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. And this was a very controversial meeting that he was having. Many of us kind of wonder, I will say that I wonder, many things go through my mind when I hear that RFK Jr. is doing another conversation about Israel, supporting Israel, or another event supporting Israel. And, you know, many of you know I'm a big supporter of RFK Jr. I hope he's not another candidate that just disappoints me. That happens over and over again. We can never fall in love with politicians because they're always going to end up disappointing you. And I know many of you are big supporters of his as well. But this is the one thing that many people are kind of like, except when it comes to his surprisingly, just seemingly, I don't even know the right word, but he's just staunchly, proudly supportive of Israel. And what many of us are bothered by is the fact that we feel like we see him posing more with the Israeli flag than with the American flag. I feel like I see more photographs of him supporting Israel than supporting America. This is a foreign country. It's a foreign country that, on a dime, if they felt like America was no longer supporting their interests, they would flip. They're not our allies through thick and thin. We're told to be their ally through thick and thin, but they're not necessarily ours. I mean, they would just, if they felt like they could find a better ally and it happens to be somebody we don't really like, they would totally do it. They're looking out for themselves. Israel looks out for itself. And it really would be nice if America started doing that as well. Start focusing on us, start focusing on the nice things that we could potentially have in our country if we stopped giving our money away to all of these different foreign nations. So he did this 2-hour event. It was originally canceled. He was meant to be doing this at a different venue, and they ended up canceling it. Actually, there was a bit of drama with this. Here's RFK Jr.'s tweet on this before we get to the actual event, what was said. He says, the New York Society for Ethical Culture just canceled my event with Rabbi Shmuley scheduled for tomorrow night. They're evidently under tremendous pressure since they violated a binding contract and canceled without explanation. This shows the DNC's fierce determination and awesome power to censor criticism of an embattled president. We are looking for another venue for tomorrow in Manhattan. Stay tuned. And he said, let Ethical New York City know if you oppose this form of political censorship, help us protect free speech. So they canceled this one day before the event, and they cited that it was, they claimed that it was, let me see, I actually have what they said that it was, that our leadership, they said it was short notice that we were booked for this event, and our leadership now only realizes that the program you are planning to present is inconsistent with the kind of programming that we support and promote, and is inconsistent with many of the values we represent. So we're not really sure what that means. Was this just another Democratic op in order to silence RFK Jr., to say, we support the DNC, we're super pro blue team Democrat, you're not the establishment Democrat candidate, so we're just going to make up some reason to cancel your event, and that is going to be that, it's just inconsistent with the kind of programming that we support, because we only support Joe Biden programming. Maybe that's what they meant, or maybe they really took issue with this staunch support of Israel, and maybe they've got, maybe they feel like Rabbi Shmuley is a bit too pro-Israel and not supporting the human rights of the Palestinians. Maybe that's how they felt, but that was just kind of an interesting thing. So they did actually end up moving this venue. And let's show you some of they ended up doing it at the Glass House in New York City. Let me just show you some of the clips that went viral that people are really talking about. The first one here is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. saying, quote, and this is what trended all over social media, if a Palestinian wants to criticize his government, he better do it in Israel. Okay, at first glance, seeing that, and Rabbi Shmuley, that is a quote that he put out there on his Twitter account, that exact quote with no more context, including not even the clip of Robert F. Kennedy talking about it, which when you talk about it, when you hear it, you'll hear him talking about it, he makes more sense. But he actually just put a GIF out there, or a GIF, and that quote, which leads a person to believe when you read that Palestine is inside of Israel, that if a Palestinian's going to criticize his government, he better do it in Israel, like he's going to be a part of Israel, like Palestine's going to be absorbed. It's Israel. And that is why Rabbi Shmuley would put that out there. This kind of goes to show his character, the type of person that RFK Jr. is aligning himself with when it comes to supporting Israel. So here's the actual clip. This is in context so that you can understand. Here it is.
It's the only place where women have rights. As you know, this week, people in Iran are being jailed. Women are being jailed for wearing habibs or not wearing habibs. It's the only place where gays have rights. There was 2 weeks ago a gay pride parade in Israel with 150,000 people in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. At the same time, the government of Iran is hanging gays from cherry pickers and castrating them. And that is true throughout the Mideast. It's the only place where there's freedom of religion, where you are free to practice any religion that you want in Israel. It's the only place where you can have freedom of expression. A Palestinian who wants to criticize his government had better do it in Israel. It's the only place where he can do it. If he does that in the West Bank, he will be tortured and killed and arrested.
Okay, so there's more context there for what he's saying rather than just the viral tweet that Rabbi Shmuley is putting out there trying to make people believe that RFK Jr. is essentially saying Palestinians are inside of Israel, that their land, the West Bank, is Judea and Samaria, which is part of Israel and should be occupied. And that is not what he was saying clearly in this clip. He's just saying that throughout the Middle East, the governments are more conservative, staunch. You are not allowed, women are not given the same human rights. People are not given the same human rights. Gays are not given the same human rights. And that if you're going to make any sort of criticism of governments, like if a Palestinian is going to criticize this government, then he's better off doing it in Israel. That's not true. By the way, in the West Bank, plenty of Palestinians criticize their government. I was there. I watched them do it. The government, there's absolutely no problem with Palestinians. They're all criticized. I mean, Palestinians, I would love to take RFK Jr. to the West Bank, and this is an open invitation. If he wants to go, I will take him on a trip to the West Bank. I will show him around. I will take him to the places that I saw, meet the people that I met, so that he can see for himself that, for one, practically every Palestinian criticizes their government. They're all sitting there saying, the PLO did this and the PLO did that, and they need to do more, they need to do better. The Palestinians are very frustrated with their own government as well as the Israeli government. So they are actually allowed to do that. But I get his point. And if you've never been there, and if you've only heard the propaganda that you've heard about the differences between Israel and Palestine and how Palestinians treat each other, or how, if that's what you've heard, I mean, people in Gaza criticize Hamas without any consequence. You can absolutely do that in Israel. Is he right to some degree? Yes, he is. Throughout the Middle East, there are much more stricter laws, very conservative cultures. Women and and gays and others are definitely limited in rights. That's something that when I was in Palestine, they even talked about how they're working on increasing women's rights for the region. That they understand that it's that women are not as progressed as they are in the West, and And I met with women's groups who are trying to gain, women's like feminist movements of Palestinian women who are wearing their full hijabs, and they were talking about how they were lawyers and they were doctors and scientists. These women were, and they were saying, and we want more rights, and they were fighting for that while at the same time respecting their religion. That is what they chose to do. So there's just some more context to that clip. It's not as atrocious as people thought. I do want to skip ahead here because for the interest of time in the show, because we do have a great guest that's coming up here. But he did also admit that Israel, there was a clip that was going viral where there's been this kind of, does Israel have nuclear weapons? Yes and no. It's never been confirmed. We pretty much suspect and know that Israel does. And he did actually basically say in one of his in one of his the clips, he said that Israel is not going to use their nuclear weapons unless they're attacked, and we know that. So he's basically confirming they have nuclear weapons. Not sure if he really knows for sure, if he's just like the rest of us who pretty much know Israel has nuclear weapons. It'd be more powerful if it came from Biden, right? Because then it's like the president of the United States really does know this. I do want to get to some of the criticism of this event. Max Blumenthal criticized Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about this in a tweet. He said tonight, this was yesterday, tonight Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is on stage defending apartheid with Shmuley Boteach, a fanatically anti-Palestinian grifter and Adelson-funded fraud dogged by financial misconduct charges. Shmuley's credentials as rabbi have been challenged by his own teacher. I think we have that tweet that we could show you from Max Blumenthal. There it is. So he's saying that, he's an apartheid, defending our apartheid with Shmuley Boteach. Yeah. So it is really disappointing, actually, to see him take such a strong stance in favor of Israel. I would prefer him to be neutral. I think the right stance when it comes to Israel is neutrality. Just like you should be with any country in the world, you should just be neutral and say, we are looking out for America's best interests and the best interests of the American people. And we will, when it best suits us, we will do business deals and partner with countries that we believe, align with us in that moment, and at other times with others. We should be, and so, it's not like, oh, wow, I'm waving the Israeli flag or I'm waving the China flag. Could you imagine or waving the Russia flag or waving the flag of Mexico and the United States, whatever, right? It's just odd. It's odd. But for some reason in this country, you have to do it as a politician, or you're going to be just shoved out of office. You're not going to even be in the running. The Israel lobby is going to come for you, and you're going to be toast. It's just a very odd thing. I would like to not see this. I don't want to see any presidential candidate waving the flag of any foreign country at all, or of any cause. I just want them waving the American flag. Is that too much to ask? Just wave the American flag. Say you're for America. You're for the American people, and that's it. And if you need to do deals with other countries, you need to make businesses, allies, whatever, you could do that. But this staunch, like, I am pro this other country, it's just really weird. Really weird, and I don't like it. And that country does commit human rights abuses against the Palestinians. There's really no debate in that now that there's video and internet, and we can actually get, now in the West Bank, in Palestine, they don't have the best internet. It's hard to get the videos out of there. That's done on purpose. The West Bank still only has 3G. You can forget about that. In Gaza, they don't have anything. So it's very difficult to get video evidence out of those regions, but it is coming out. More people are becoming aware. There's a lot of people who are very staunchly pro-Israel. Once they go to those regions into West Bank and Gaza, they turn around with a completely different viewpoint and say, whoa, I didn't expect that. That is very different than the propaganda I have been fed in the United States. And so it'd be nice if RFK Jr. would just take a trip over to the Palestinians, because if you're going to be an American president, one of the proud kind of notches you could put on your belt when it comes to being an American president is that you help facilitate peace between the Palestinians and Israel, that you solved that problem, that conflict between those two groups of people. You cannot do that if you're waving the Israeli flag, going around saying, I am pro-Israel, I am pro-Israel. You've got to be neutral, and you've got to say, I am pro the Jewish people and pro their right to self-determination, and I am pro Palestinian people and their right to self-determination as well. And I will do my best as an American president to facilitate peace between those two groups of people and to end the conflict once and for all. That is the right political move. This one is not so much. As much as I like them, I really don't like this. I really, really don't like this. All right, we do need to move on with the show. But first, cbdistillery.com is giving Rumble an exclusive offer, and it's incredible. Right now, you can get up to 50% off everything when you use the code RUMBLE. You could choose from a range of carefully formulated CBD and other plant-based solutions for relaxation, stress, sleep, and pain after physical activity, even mood and focus. They extract healing plant compounds and vital nutrients for your whole body. There's no artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, or sweeteners, just 100% clean ingredients. So don't miss this Rumble exclusive sale and get up to 50% off your order. Visit cbdistillery.com and enter Rumble. That's cbdistillery.com and enter Rumble. Not available, unfortunately, in the great state of Idaho, Iowa, and South Dakota. Freelance journalist David Zweig, who's written extensively about COVID, recently reported that the New York Times cited false CDC COVID data, inflating the pediatric mortality count by nearly 40%. David is with us now. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Kim. Thanks for having me.
So the CDC COVID data is false. Like, tell us about this, first of all.
So it's complicated, but the CDC strangely keeps two different official data counts of COVID mortality. They have reasons behind why they use both of these systems. So it's not that they're necessarily trying to deceive people, but the problem is one of them is accurate and the other one is not accurate. The CDC knows that one of these databases is not accurate, yet they keep it remaining public. And it's been this way for years. And unfortunately, there are a lot of journalists who continue to use the inaccurate database when they cite COVID mortality statistics. And with pediatric numbers, they consistently have been vastly inflated using this inaccurate database.
So how do they calculate them? Like, explain the two different ones and how they go about getting those numbers.
Right. So the database that has the wrong numbers, they sort of pull data from various case data from different states and territories, and it kind of funnels in, but it's very preliminary. And then as time elapses, they can go back and refine it. So it's not like the most definitive answer. The other database, which is the NCHS, is based on death certificates, and that's considered the official count. And over and over and over again, the official count has been much, much lower than this unofficial count that's done sort of more just done in real time. The unofficial count is used by the CDC ostensibly to help them sort of track trends that are happening in real time. It's more of like a tool. So it's odd to me that that's made public at all. So it's not necessarily that that's a bad thing for them to use for whatever purposes they have, epidemiological type of studying that they're looking to do. But it's not the correct number. They know it's not the correct number because they've communicated with multiple journalists about this in the past for years, and yet they continue to post these wrong numbers.
They post the wrong number. The CDC posts them and journalists use them, or do you think that it's more like, which is more egregious, that journalists use the wrong data, or that the CDC publishes the wrong data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't know. I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. So, I mean, I think the original sin here is with the CDC. They just simply shouldn't be making data publicly available that they know is incorrect. Or if they're going to do so, I think I mentioned this in my article. I said, if you're going to do that, at least put a large disclaimer at the top. These are preliminary data. They are not to be taken as the exact numbers. And in fact, we know that the pediatric numbers are vastly inflated. If they put that giant disclaimer at the top, I would be happy with that. But in the absence of that, we then have to ask ourselves, why are journalists who presumably are science reporters who are covering this stuff, particularly at prestigious outlets, why are they repeatedly using the wrong database? I'm just a freelancer, a lowly freelancer, and I've been on the COVID beat for a long time. I've been well aware of which is the correct and which is the not correct numbers. And they're really, really different. So the problem is these incorrect numbers are used in the media, and they give people the wrong impression about how many people have actually died, in particular children. And the implications of that, of course, are that those numbers are used as a tool both by government officials for either retroactively to say, oh, it was worth it to do X, Y, or Z, to close schools or whatever it is. Look how many people died. Or they're going to be used for future policies,
Yeah.
or just used, in whatever arguments people are having on Twitter or at their, dinner table. They're the wrong numbers, and journalists should know. They should know this by now. This has been going on for years. So when I saw it in the New York Times, it was really frustrating, just because this is an ongoing problem, and even people who are sort of really just casual followers of sort of like COVID data have been well aware of this. So it's kind of surprising that a number of journalists were not aware,
Yeah.
presumably not aware.
Well, I mean, so the reason why, obviously, it seems like in this latest example with New York Times is for agenda, right? It's oftentimes to serve a purpose or to serve an agenda, and in this one, it's about smearing Ron DeSantis, right? They're saying the steep cost of Ron DeSantis's vaccine turnabout. So they're trying to say, oh, Ron DeSantis bad, right? So now we're going to use this example of how many children died. So how many did they say died in this piece that that they got the data versus what was the actual number?
Right. So in the piece, they said nearly 2,300 had died. But as of the publication of my reporting, the latest numbers were 1,668. So, this is nearly 40% higher than the number that they reported. And in one regard, people may say, well, what's the difference? 2,300, 16 something hundred, what does it matter? But again, we're talking about almost 40% higher. And there have been times where the gap has been even larger than that. Look, if you're going to report numbers, you should report the accurate numbers. I'm not going to speak to anyone's motive or anything like that, whether from the CDC or the New York Times. Your viewers can, make up their own minds about, whether things are purposeful, whether it's negligent. But I would, in my view, for this to be going on this long from the CDC when they're well aware of this problem, and for them to continue to do this, something strange is going on. I don't know what it is, but that's pretty odd. And then similarly, from a media perspective, to just continue to cite the wrong numbers. And it is curious that it seems to be the case that the wrong numbers always go in one direction, in
Right.
the worst direction. That I haven't done some sort of systematic analysis. That's certainly my impression, that they always seem to go in one direction. So these types of things matter, and people need to get this right, both reporters and more importantly, the CDC.
Yeah, and I think the big concern about this, it's not just like, oh, look at these reporters these journalists who are supposed to be journalists not really doing their journalism duty, right, of actually looking at things and assessing it before they go and talking about it. But it's beyond that. It's not just a failure of journalism, but it's what this type of information does to the reader, who then feels fear, panic, wants policy made based on that information. You've got government officials reading these papers saying, oh my gosh, we have to do something about this, or schools saying we've got to mandate vaccines or whatever it might be, right? There's actual consequences, not just, oh, you're a bad journalist, you should have done a little bit more digging. There's actual real life consequences when it comes to this type of reporting, which we saw during the pandemic. I mean, all the reporting, the death tickers on CNN and MSNBC, we saw all the narratives that just continue to be pushed without actually doing any due diligence. And that right there caused actual policies, mandates, actual decisions. People made decisions on who they even wanted to be friends with based on the data that was being put out there. So there's real life consequences, unfortunately, which I think is the point of journalism, right? There should be, you're supposed to report, and then people make decisions based on that reporting, you hope, for better or for worse. And unfortunately, in this case, a lot of it was done for the worse, it seems.
I mean, yeah, look, mistakes happen. I'm certain there are errors in my reporting. Everyone makes mistakes. I just
Well, but
find
this
it
is like a
frustrating.
3-year mistake. I mean, this is 3 years
Yeah.
they've been
I'm
they've
trying
been
to be
making these
generous
mistakes.
because
Right.
I'm trying to be because look, no one's perfect. What is frustrating and upsetting is that right, the errors continue to happen. And there are 3 bylines on this piece as well. There are multiple layers of editors. There's copy editors. Whoa, losing some light. So that's the sort of curious part is how many layers it's had to go through and still have an error.
Right. Right.
There we go.
Oh, there you go. Now you're all bright
Back.
again.
The sun is out. Here we go.
Let me ask you about this other piece that you wrote about, because it is alarming that journalists they're not doing their due diligence and numbers are getting inflated. And that is definitely, even if it's just by a little bit, it causes panic. It's actual misinformation.
And it's not a little bit. This is like 40% inflation.
Right, a 40% increase is a lot.
Significant.
Yeah. That is significant. Misinformation that was spread by the New York Times. Let's talk about this other piece that you've written about, the little discussed consequence of the pandemic for children. A lot of us talk often about the lack of education for kids, how they missed out on a lot of schooling, how they're really behind. But you've actually pointed out that there's another thing, another consequence, another missed kind of a big event for children. And what was that?
Right. So I wrote a piece about missed medical care. Everyone's been talking about quote unquote learning loss, which is a real thing and which is super important. So I'm glad that's gotten a lot of attention. But one of the things that, to my mind, hasn't really been covered very much are some of the medical effects of the quote lockdown policies and in particular school closures and the sort of broader atmosphere of fear. And it's interesting that you're bringing up this other article that I wrote, because to me, the theme is the same now that we're talking about it from the previous article, which is this sort of intersection between the public health authorities and their policies and decisions and the media and how the media does or doesn't report certain things. So you had this kind of like nexus of public health policy decisions, and then you had the media kind of stirring up fear at every opportunity. And the combination of those two things led to millions, not thousands or hundreds, millions upon millions of children who missed medical care, missed pediatric appointments. And I list a whole bunch of different studies and link to them in my piece where you had children who had appendicitis. And there are multiple studies on this where they found that they were arriving at the hospital much, much later than hospitals typically would see because people were afraid. So they were waiting to go to the hospital until it was basically an emergency. And they had a much higher incidence of very serious complications and surgery and whatnot related to appendicitis. There were kids who were showing up in a very delayed schedule for onset of acute diabetes that was coming on, and this kind of long list. There were cancers, there's tumors. There were all these different studies that have come out where we see where people were delayed, and the parents and the children were afraid to go in for medical care because they had such an atmosphere and such a climate of fear, combined with the actual policies that weren't really allowing people out and about to varying degrees. So this is something, the repercussions of this are really hard to measure because it's so nebulous. But as I point out in my article, and like I said, I link to a whole bunch of studies, that the evidence is very clear. There's no ambiguity that an enormous amount of harm was incurred by children for missing a lot of these medical appointments, not just for these emergencies that I pointed out, for appendicitis and things like that. And there are many, many cases of that, but just for missing your general pediatric appointments. When a newborn, I forget what it is, but I think it's something like they're supposed to have something like 6 appointments in their first year where the physician can check the newborn child for reaching various milestones. And if a child doesn't reach a milestone, well, then they can intervene. What's going wrong? Should we run some tests? What's happening? Well, when the kids don't show up, no tests are going to be run. And then you have this delayed attention to the child. And look, we're talking about an enormous denominator. There are something like 60 plus million children in America. So even if it's a tiny numerator, a tiny percent of that, we're still talking about millions of children where they had missed and delayed care and where there are consequences for that.
Yeah, it's really scary. I know with adults that's been a big issue as well because oftentimes the real serious stuff presents to adults the older we get. And I remember even at the beginning of the pandemic, I had a skin rash. And, it's the most bizarre thing because they were like, oh, well, we're going to do a telehealth or just send us photographs of it. I mean, luckily it wasn't anything, it was just, like eczema or something. But what if it was skin cancer and they couldn't really, you need to see that in person to be able to diagnose that, to say that looks really suspicious and that's more than just eczema. That's like an actual something we really need to take a look at. And there was just that doctors were not willing to see patients. They closed down their clinics and said, send us a photograph or we're just not working right now. I mean, I think we're going to see serious numbers of premature deaths and premature illnesses that people shouldn't have, things that have gone, cancer that has progressed way further than it should have. And we're going to start seeing more of that because people were unable to get to those appointments early on, and even throughout the pandemic. And even now, there are still a lot of people who are still very afraid. I think it's kind of slowing down. But would you say with these kids, how long, or even just in general? I mean, you've been reporting on COVID throughout this entire time. Do you think that, I say, how long do you think it lasted? The real hysteria to where people were not getting the things that they needed. What would you say the timeline was on that, the time frame?
I'd have to look back I reported on, I think it was in JAMA, one of the JAMA journals, the survey. There have been multiple surveys of large samples, in the thousands of parents about this delayed and missed care. Some of them were early on in the pandemic when we all would presume is the most sort of acute time where people really weren't leaving their home and were afraid to go to the hospital or to a doctor's office. But surprisingly, many of these things continued quite far into the pandemic. And I'll tell you, beyond, it's not only about parental fears, it also, I didn't report this in the article only because I didn't have data on it, but I know this factually from tons of anecdotal information that I, fact check myself. Many pediatricians' offices were closed unless you had a COVID test or something before. They wouldn't even let you go in the office. Because of my reporting, I often have had many people just sort of reach out to me, and bring their COVID problems to me, asking for help or, just lend them an ear. And I've had numerous people say, hey, I wanted to bring my daughter to the doctor's office. She wasn't feeling well, and they wouldn't let us go. They would not let us in unless she had a COVID test. And God forbid, if she had COVID, they wouldn't see her. I mean, this is a doctor's job, is to see patients. You have a kid. So this is a whole thing that really hasn't been reported on. I don't know what the ethics are of this, or if there's some sort of board, rules or policies. I guess doctors can close their offices if they see fit. But it's quite a remarkable circumstance, the amount of pediatric offices that either were outright closed or had pretty stringent rules about who they would and would not let come in to see them as patients. What a remarkable occurrence. And it's something that I don't think has gotten a lot of or any real coverage.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've been really focused on this. You actually have a book coming out. Is it next year this book is coming out about American schools during the pandemic? Wow.
Yes. Yeah. It's right now my editor is making me cut a lot because it's like, 1,000 pages. There's so much there. But yeah, and the book is going to be not about all of the harms. It's not this, what they might call like a victim porn thing. It's not about that. It's really about the decision-making process. I'm fascinated by the sort of anatomy of like, how are decisions made? How did this happen? All the things that went down. So I try to view this massive problem from, every which way, all these different angles, and trying to put that together.
That'll be interesting to read, actually, because I think that's really one of the most important, if not the most important topic that we should be talking more about in order to prevent this from ever happening again. It's how did you get to that decision to begin with? What led up to that decision that then caused all of this harm? We know it's good to talk about the harm because then we say, oh, shoot, we probably don't want to do that again because look at all the terrible harm that it caused. And I think we definitely need to be doing more talking about the harms of the actual pandemic, not just COVID, the virus, but the lockdowns, the mandates, the vaccines push, all of these things. But yeah, it's once you know the harms, it's important to know how did you even get to that point where you then would make a decision that would cause so much harm, so that we just never do that again, hopefully.
Well, that's exactly right. A lot of the reporting, and some of which has been excellent, has been on the harms to kids, which again is super important. But to me, that's pretty manifest. It's sort of obvious, the harms. And to me, what was far more interesting and important was, I just take it for granted that people understand, the consequences. I touch on it in the book, in the book for sure. But what I really wanted to bring to light were all these series of decisions and things that happened that went wrong. And because when you only report about the harms, and not to keep picking on the New York Times, but what the Times has done a lot of times recently is they say the pandemic closed schools, or COVID,
Right.
did this. And I'm like, no, let's be clear. Policy decisions did that to children.
Right.
People
Right.
made choices. So when you blame everything on the pandemic or on COVID, when these things are actually the result of human decisions, which, by the way, were very, very different in many other countries than they
Right.
were here. So that's the problem, is when you only report on the harms and you sort of combine that with this, the pandemic did X, Y, or Z, it takes away agency. It makes it
Yeah.
seem as though a bad thing happened. Shrug. Let's. You need to actually analyze and identify. Well, yes, a bad thing happened, but decisions caused many of these things to happen. Now, people can argue about, were these decisions wise? Were they worthwhile or not worthwhile? Cost benefit. That's fine, but let's at least go from a starting point that the pandemic didn't cause children to be home from school.
Right.
Decisions
Yeah.
caused that to happen.
Right. Policy decisions caused schools to be closed. And that's why kids ended up, because in Sweden, they said, make your own decision. We're keeping things open. It's up to you. And they found, now they're looking at the research and showing that people modified their behavior. So they didn't, if they were older and high risk, they chose not. They made the choice themselves not to go out as much and socialize, not to go to concerts. They made those personal decisions, modified their own personal behavior based on the information they were given, and they had a very successful outcome because of that. And that's interesting because it shows when you trust the people, when you give them the information and you trust them, you're an adult, you're smart, you can make the decision for yourself. People will make naturally a decision that is self-sparing. People don't want to die naturally. Naturally they'll do what it takes to, I got to save myself, and they will make those decisions. So it's interesting, I think, I think you make a good point to put into the perspective of, it wasn't the pandemic that did this, it was the policy decision that did this. And that's a great point. David, thank you so much for being here. People can check out definitely your Substack. SilentLunch.net is what is that even? Why Silent Lunch? I'm curious.
So yeah, the origin of Silent Lunch is, I took that from, during the pandemic, many schools forced children to eat in silence at lunchtime. And to me, that represents just the sort of peak of the idiocy and cruelty of so many of these things. Imagine little kids for a year. I actually, in another article in my Substack, I have this incredible report from not that long ago of a school in upstate New York that was still compelling silent lunches this school year. This spring, they were still doing it. This is in Ithaca, New York. The children were prohibited from speaking during lunch, and that carried on through 2023. It's a remarkable. They also were forced to mask indoors and outdoors, but so there's just amazing stuff. But I like the idea of silent lunch because I hope that it can also mean something else, like the idea of sort of someone eating a sandwich and just quietly, contemplating things while reading my
articles.
Substack.
Right.
So it has a dual meaning. But silent lunch, man, what something I don't ever want anyone to forget, that's what they did to kids. And needless to say, there's zero evidence that there was any benefit for anyone of doing that.
Terrible, absolutely terrible. But you're doing great work. So thank you so much for being on the show, talking to us about this, and appreciate all of your reporting that these other outlets are not doing. And that's why we turn to reporters like you, to actually give us the real information. So appreciate that. Thank you, David.
I'm trying. Everyone come to my Substack, please, for more of this type of reporting you're not going to find elsewhere.
All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any comments, questions, you want to reach out, shout out, whatever, go ahead and email me, kim@kimiversen.com. And I love getting your feedback. Maybe you've got guest suggestions, topic suggestions, information, just feedback, general thoughts. Love to hear from you completely there at kim@kimiversen.com. Otherwise, guys, we'll be back tomorrow night with another great show, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Until then, guys, have a great night. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.